Ukrainian drones shut down Moscow's airports for the 10th time in 24 hours, leaving thousands of Russian civilians stranded on terminal floors with nowhere to go. But Putin's panicked response to these airport closures reveals what terrifies him more than any NATO weapon or Ukrainian counteroffensive. Putin built his entire regime on the promise of security and strength, convincing Russians that he alone can protect them from chaos and foreign threats. When that image cracks, his power crumbles with it. But the pattern of Putin's fears goes deeper than public image. Every time Ukraine strikes Russian infrastructure, airports, rail lines, energy facilities, Putin faces an impossible choice: protect his people or continue the war. He can't do both, and his own citizens are starting to notice. The strategic targets Ukraine chooses reveal exactly what keeps Putin awake at night, and it's not what you think. Moscow's airports shut down for the 10th time in 24 hours as Ukrainian drones penetrated Russian airspace with devastating psychological impact. Thousands of Russian civilians found themselves stranded in terminal buildings, sleeping on floors, waiting in endless queues as flight after flight was canceled or delayed indefinitely. The scenes at Domodedovo, Sheremetyevo, and Vnukovo airports were chaotic. Families with children camped on terminal floors. Business travelers missed crucial meetings. The normal rhythm of Russian life ground to a halt as the war finally reached Moscow's doorstep. But the airport closures revealed something Putin had desperately tried to hide from his own people. For nearly 3 years, he had promised Russians that the special military operation would not affect their daily lives. The war was supposed to be distant, controlled, invisible to ordinary citizens. CNN reported that the drone attacks caused travel chaos at Moscow's airports, while deadly waves of Russian missiles pounded Ukraine. The contrast was stark. Russians experienced inconvenience while Ukrainians faced death. But even this small taste of disruption sent shockwaves through Russian society. But Putin's panicked response to the airport closures revealed what terrifies him more than any NATO weapon or Ukrainian counteroffensive. His greatest fear isn't military defeat. It's his own people realizing he can't protect them. The strongman image that built his power crumbled every time ordinary Russians couldn't board their flights because of Ukrainian drones. Putin's regime had built its legitimacy on a simple promise: security in exchange for political freedom. Russians accepted authoritarian rule because Putin guaranteed they would be safe from chaos, terrorism, and foreign threats. The airport closures shattered that fundamental contract. Russian state media struggled to explain why Ukrainian drones could penetrate hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory and disrupt civilian life in the capital. The official narrative of Russian military superiority became impossible to maintain when Moscow's airports shut down repeatedly. But the immediate consequence went beyond propaganda problems. Russian civilians began asking uncomfortable questions. If Putin can't protect Moscow's airports, what else can't he protect? If Ukrainian drones can reach the capital, how safe is anywhere in Russia? The psychological impact was devastating for Putin's image. Russians had accepted his authoritarianism because he promised strength and security. When Ukrainian drones proved he couldn't deliver either, the regime's legitimacy began cracking. But the most damaging consequence was the comparison Russians could see with their own eyes. While their flights were canceled and their airports shut down, Putin was launching massive attacks on Ukrainian civilians. The war was coming home to Russia while escalating abroad. The immediate consequence of the airport closures was the beginning of the end of Putin's strongman image among his own people. The pattern of Ukrainian strikes revealed a sophisticated understanding of Putin's vulnerabilities. Ukraine didn't just attack Moscow's airports randomly. They targeted the infrastructure that connected Putin's elite to the outside world, the systems that made normal life possible for ordinary Russians. The Kamenolomny rail junction attack cut vital supply lines to Crimea, Putin's prized possession and symbol of Russian strength. The peninsula he had illegally annexed in 2014 as proof of Russian power was now isolated and vulnerable, dependent on supply routes Ukraine could cut at will. But the escalation went beyond infrastructure attacks. Ukraine systematically targeted the symbols of Russian normalcy: airports, rail lines, energy facilities, forcing Putin to choose between protecting his people and continuing the war. He couldn't do both effectively. Each Ukrainian strike forced Putin deeper into an impossible position. Defending Russian infrastructure required resources that weakened his offensive capabilities in Ukraine, but failing to defend Russian infrastructure exposed his weakness to his own people. But the most damaging escalation was psychological. Every successful Ukrainian strike on Russian territory proved that Putin's promises of security were empty. The war he claimed was under control was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. The escalation revealed Putin's greatest fear, being exposed as weak and unable to protect the people whose support his power depended on. The breaking point came when Putin realized he faced an impossible choice. Every Ukrainian strike on Russian infrastructure demanded a response, but every response revealed his limitations. He could retaliate against Ukrainian civilians, but that only invited more strikes on Russian targets. The airport closures became a symbol of Putin's strategic failure. He had started a war he claimed would be quick and decisive, but 3 years later, Ukrainian drones were shutting down Moscow's airports while Russian civilians slept on terminal floors. But the breaking point went deeper than military failure. Putin's entire political system was built on the perception of strength and control. When Ukrainian drones could penetrate Russian airspace at will and disrupt civilian life in the capital, that perception collapsed. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Putin claimed to be protecting Russians from Western threats, but Ukrainian attacks were causing more disruption to Russian civilian life than any NATO action ever had. His protection was worse than useless. It was counterproductive. But the most devastating aspect of the breaking point was its inevitability. Every escalation Putin chose made the situation worse. Every retaliation invited counter-retaliation. Every promise of security was broken by the next Ukrainian strike. The breaking point revealed that Putin had trapped himself in a war he couldn't win and couldn't end without admitting defeat to his own people. The strategic revelation became clear when analyzing Putin's response patterns. He consistently overreacted to attacks on Russian infrastructure while underreacting to military defeats in Ukraine. The airport closures mattered more to him than losing entire army units. This revealed Putin's true vulnerability. His power depended on maintaining the illusion of normalcy for Russian civilians. Military defeats could be hidden or spun as tactical retreats, but airport closures affected ordinary Russians directly and visibly. But the revelation went deeper. Ukraine had discovered that attacking Russian infrastructure was more effective than destroying Russian military equipment. Every disrupted flight, every power outage, every supply line cut weakened Putin's political position more than battlefield victories. The critical insight was that Putin's greatest fear wasn't NATO weapons or Ukrainian resistance. It was his own people realizing he was weak. Every Ukrainian strike on Russian territory chipped away at the strongman image that was the foundation of his power. But the most damaging revelation was strategic. Putin had no effective response to infrastructure attacks that didn't make his position worse. Retaliation invited escalation. Defensive measures revealed weakness. Ignoring the attacks proved incompetence. The critical revelation was that Ukraine had found Putin's Achilles heel, his dependence on his own people's perception of his strength and competence. Ukraine's new strategy focused on systematic pressure on Russian infrastructure rather than purely military targets. Every airport closure, every rail line cut, every power outage served the strategic goal of exposing Putin's weakness to his own people. The approach was sophisticated and sustainable. Instead of trying to match Russia's military spending or manpower, Ukraine targeted the systems that made normal life possible for Russians. The psychological impact was devastating and the cost was minimal, but the strategy went beyond infrastructure attacks. Ukraine began timing strikes to maximize their political impact, hitting airports during holiday travel, cutting power during winter, disrupting rail lines during harvest season. Each strike was designed to force Putin into impossible choices: defend Russian infrastructure and weaken the war effort, or continue the war and leave Russian civilians vulnerable. Either choice weakened his political position, but most importantly, the new strategy was designed to be sustainable indefinitely. Ukraine could continue infrastructure attacks as long as the war continued, while Putin's resources for defending Russian territory were limited and declining. The new strategy turned Putin's greatest strength, his control over Russian society, into his greatest vulnerability. Putin's nightmare became reality as the war came home to Russia. Every Ukrainian strike on Russian infrastructure proved that the strongman emperor had no clothes. His promises of security were empty, his threats were hollow, and his power was built on illusions. The airport closures became the symbol of Putin's failure. Russians who had accepted authoritarianism in exchange for security found themselves sleeping on terminal floors while their leader launched attacks that only invited more retaliation. But the resolution went beyond individual incidents. Putin's entire political model, trading freedom for security, collapsed when he couldn't deliver security. The social contract that had sustained his regime for decades was broken by Ukrainian drones over Moscow. The new reality was that Putin's greatest fear had been realized. His own people were beginning to see him as weak, incompetent, and unable to protect them. The strongman image that had built his power was crumbling with every airport closure. But the ultimate resolution was strategic. Putin had started a war to project strength and ended up exposing weakness. He had promised to protect Russians from foreign threats and instead made them targets. He had claimed to control events and instead lost control of his own narrative. Putin's biggest fear, being exposed as weak before his own people, became the defining reality of his reign. And Ukrainian drones over Moscow made sure every Russian could see the truth. The chaos at Moscow's airports transformed Putin's greatest strength into his greatest weakness by exposing the strongman as unable to protect his own people. Every canceled flight, every stranded passenger, every moment of disruption proved that Putin's promises of security were empty and his power was built on illusions. Ukraine's systematic targeting of Russian infrastructure revealed Putin's Achilles heel, his dependence on his own people's perception of his strength and competence. Every Ukrainian strike chipped away at the foundation of his political power more effectively than any battlefield victory. But Putin's nightmare has only just begun. As Ukrainian capabilities grow and Russian defenses weaken, the war will continue coming home to Russia in ways that make airport closures seem like minor inconveniences.